what really drives us as chefs and farmers and everything that we do at Lost Creek Farm is the sort of story behind the cuisine. So, the business that we operate, we sort of have this format where it's sort of just one seating in an evening, and throughout each course, we'll sort of come out and as we're serving food, we sort of tell the story behind, maybe it's behind a particular ingredient or a seed that someone has given us, or a recipe or a certain tradition. And it's sort of an experience that is, designed to be a little bit immersive, in that you are enjoying a meal, but as you're enjoying that meal, you're like hearing about all the different components that sort of made that meal possible. Um, so let's see. I should talk a little bit about what this sort of means for us as a business, and just personally to sort of be talking about something like Appalachian Food Stories. And one of the places that I sort of like to start is just sort of revisiting, what happened a few years ago when we started Lost Creek Farm back in like 2016, 2017. There were a lot of sort of national trend lists or things in the media that were defining and sort of projecting Appalachian food as being trendy. And some people were very excited about that. They thought it would sort of bring great things to the mountains. But what Amy and I sort of saw happening was sort of the exact opposite of what we wanted to see in it. In some cases, it was that, what was being sort of put out there as Appalachian food was something that was kind of narrow in definition and focus. And actually, that definition was coming in a lot of cases from people who sort of were outside of the region and sort of removed from the stories of regional foodways. There was a lot of sort of this, kind of classifying Appalachian food as like an odd or surprising sort of thing to be on a trend list. And what we sort of saw was a need for real stories behind foods that people were sort of looking at as being, Appalachian, and for those stories to be coming from people in our own communities, rather than sort of, defined by national food media, especially, or someone somewhere else. There was sort of a lot of kind of outside gatekeeping of what it meant, what qualified as Appalachian food or what didn't. So, when we saw that, we sort of said, as lifelong West Virginians with a culinary business, especially one that was sort of rooted in story to begin with, we sort of saw like a pressing need in a way to try to refocus stories on the region, particularly to sort of instill a sense of empowerment and try to return benefits of some sort to people in the region. Because as long as those stories are being told by somebody else, we don't see benefits. We don't sort of allow ourselves to take control and power over a narrative. So this was, at least to sort of set a little bit of context here, this was a big sort of impetus for us to kind of kick things up a notch in terms of the storytelling. So with these events, that I'm going to have this weekend and that we've been having all summer long, that we're going to have through October on the farm, one of the things that I like to do is I like to start every event with these crackers. And they're very simple crackers, but these crackers are actually the communion wafers that my grandmother used to make at her church. And I sort of kick off every event with these crackers for a number of reasons, but one of them is to sort of, ground us in, like, just to start the storytelling and sort of ground us in some of the ideas that I'll be talking about through the stories throughout the whole event. And since I kicked the dinner events off with this, I wanted to kick off this presentation the same way, at least talking about the communion wafers. And the story of those communion wafers for me is, that when my parents were were working, a lot when I was very young, maybe 5 or 6 years old. My grandmother would babysit my brother and I during the week, and she would take us to her kitchen, or sorry, her church. And in the basement of that church, there was a kitchen, and my grandmother and the other elderly women in that church would be rolling out these big sheets of dough for communion wafers for Sunday service. And my brother and I, we did not go to church with my grandma on Sunday morning. We weren't raised in the church. So being that young, we had no idea like why these communion wafers were actually being made. We had no idea what the religious significance of them was, but they were just these kind of like tasty little snacks, that my brother and I, we would sort of sneak in as they were making them, and we would sort of feed ourselves these communion wafers. And I think sometimes maybe get in a little bit of trouble because we were eating the communion wafers that were supposed to be reserved for Sunday service. But when my grandmother died, I inherited her recipe collection, and in that recipe collection was the recipe for these communion wafers. And in terms of the sort of complexity of the recipe, it's one of the simplest things that we work with. It's just 4 ingredients. There's flour, there's oil, there's salt, and there's water. But in terms of the sentimental value and the story, it was very powerful for me to revisit that recipe, not because it was connected to my grandmother, but because when I was so young, 4, 5, 6 years old, this, as far back as I can remember, is the first image in my mind of people making food together as a community. So I have very vivid memories of all the women in that church making those communion wafers. So because so many of the stories that I tell, because so many of the traditions that were passed down, the seeds, the recipes, the techniques that define everything that I do as a chef, that is so sort of rooted and based in the idea of community, that I always like to share the story of these communion wafers, and to sort of open people's minds to the stories that are going to come. So, I think with that in mind, I should probably also talk a little bit about just my background as a chef and a storyteller. And, when I was about 15 or 16 years old, I think is when I realized that I wanted to become a chef. So it actually, before I graduated high school, I'd enrolled in a culinary school in Charleston, South Carolina. I grew up near Charleston, West Virginia, and I was dead set on going. And then I worked in some restaurant type jobs when I was in high school. And I had one that just sort of made me want to walk away from the restaurant industry, at least for the time. So I actually backed out of culinary school, and instead I went to journalism school at West Virginia University, where you guys are now on campus. And I always say that's sort of the best thing that ever happened to me as a chef, because whatever I learned, or whatever I would have learned in culinary school, maybe not everything, but a lot of it you can sort of pick up through working in other environments. And, but you don't really get skills as a storyteller so much, when you're in culinary school. You're sort of learning a lot of technical stuff, but what really drives me, what inspires me, what keeps me going, defines our business is the story. So when I was in college, I did a lot of work still around food, but it was storytelling work. And it further connected me to this place and to the stories, and it sort of opened, my eyes to a lot of the nuance and the complexities that were there that don't often get told through stories about food, through stories about Appalachia, through stories about anywhere really. So that was sort of something that really, inspired me to ultimately tell more stories, and then to come back to food professionally, because I had kind of taken about 10 years or so and done something completely different. So what are some of the stories that I'm going to tell this weekend? Well, one of them is about salt trout. This is a tradition that dates back, many hundreds of years, maybe longer, pre European contact here in Appalachia. But the tradition of salt trout was one that required people to go deep into the wilderness to catch wild trout, to bury them in salt, and throughout the year they would reconstitute that salt after it was dried out and preserved with the salt. And that tradition was very rich, and it was something that people really look forward to, not just for the recipes, but for the ritual of being able to go, deep into the wilderness as a family or with friends. And then that tradition is sort of rather abruptly, compared to a lot of other traditions, food traditions in Appalachia, it ended. Um, and it ended so quickly, not because people didn't need to preserve trout with salt anymore. Some of our traditions disappear over time because we got refrigeration and we don't have to do the same techniques to preserve them. But this particular tradition died out so quickly because the logging industry decimated almost every mile of wild trout stream in West Virginia and Appalachia when the east was clear cut. So some of the things that we might serve with salt trout is some kind of a spread or a buttermilk poached trout or some kind of a stew. But with every one of those dishes, we tell a story that is meant to sort of, in a lot of ways, it's sort of meant to show the importance, of course, of that tradition, of that ritual, of what happened with settler colonialism in Appalachia, with the destruction of resources, but also, to sort of be a little bit of a warning, if you will, about, what happens when we're not careful with our resources and how it impacts us, culturally beyond just the tangible resource itself. Some of the stories that we tell are to sort of, paint a picture of our community here locally that maybe has a little bit of an element of surprise, because stories of Appalachia typically are, so sort of narrowly focused on whiteness, and more specifically, I mean, there's this sort of idea that, there's not a lot of diversity, that there sort of is like this predominance of Scots Irish heritage here and not much of anything else, but in the community where I am now, Clarksburg, and then our county here in north central West Virginia, and really all of Appalachia, there's a lot of sort of diversity that goes unseen because of those narrow focused narratives. And this is a family that lives very close to us, and their heritage is Spanish, and they're in early 20th century, 1920s, 1930s, there were about 20,000 Spanish immigrants living in Harrison County. Mostly, they had come to work in the zinc factories. Not that many families, relatively speaking, are still around, but those who do really carry on a lot of food traditions. And Spanish sausage is one of the food traditions that that you see a lot, that these people still make. So this is maybe one of 3 or 4 families that are still making this particular blood sausage called morcilla, and they still pronounce it with that old world sort of accent of the sort of th sound. So if you hear them talk about their sausage, they'll say chorizo or longaniza or morcilla, and they will get on you for pronouncing it as morcilla or chorizo if you do that. But this is always interesting for me, because as a chef, if I go out and I talk about this Spanish sausage, sometimes, it doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes people will say, I came here to learn about, West Virginia or Appalachian food, and instead you're talking about Spanish food. And it sort of, as disappointing as that can be, it sort of opens up a dialogue and a conversation about, who belongs in a community. And, a lot of times I really enjoy the results of that conversation, because it sort of challenges people's sort of preconceived notions about, how sort of monolithic a place can be. And you sort of say, well, like, why doesn't this cuisine belong in, the narrative of Appalachia, if these people are of the place and of the community, just like me or whoever else? Sometimes, we don't always tell the stories at the dinner table. Amy and I, we produce a lot of media. We've made a podcast in the past. We've done some video documentary work, and a lot of times this is sort of focused on stories that are not always told about, people's sort of interaction with the landscape, with Appalachia. But they're stories that we think are very important. So this is a good friend of ours, Jonathan Hall. This is just one example of many, and Jonathan is an avid outdoorsman, a hunter and a forager, and his experience as someone who cherishes those outdoor activities, those traditions, but has a very different experience in the outdoors as a Black hunter and forager than I do, being white and from the region, and sort of having this unrestricted access to public land or private land. It's a story that is not told so much, and I think it sort of is a story that for me emphasizes who the audience really is. A lot of times with talk about Appalachia and stereotypes, we're sort of trying to project to an audience other than people who live here, to sort of convince people outside the region that we're different than what they might think we are. But this is a story that is one of the many stories that we really want people here to sort of think about, and oftentimes sort of be exposed to that idea of different experiences based on race and nationality and lots of other things, for oftentimes for the first time. It's when people are really considering this. But I know that you all have gathered in Morgantown as seed keepers. This is a conference about seeds, and Amy and I, we have a keen interest in preserving seeds, but also preserving the stories of seeds. And as fellow seed keepers, I think probably know, as well as anyone else, that like what drives what we do is a lot of times the story, right? Like these beans are more than just beans, the tomatoes are more than just tomatoes, and the seeds, of course, are more than these tiny tangible things that we put in the ground to grow food. Every one of these tomatoes, every one of these beans sort of came to us with a story, and that story is what sort of makes it more than just a bean, more than just a tomato. And it changes your sort of experience too as you're eating this food. I mean, one of my favorite things to do as a chef is to sort of serve some of these things that you see here, but to talk about it, and to talk about the people who gifted us those seeds, and the responsibility that we inherited with it, and the sort of pressure that we feel when 94-year-old Lou Maori says to us, I don't know how much time I'm going to have here, but this bean is, it's a part of me. It's a living, breathing thing that that means so much, and I want you to keep it going. So that's like a big thing for us, and sort of thinking about the why of the stories is, why do we focus on stories? Well, a lot of it is because when we accept something, when that seed, that interaction, when it changes hands, we know that we inherit so much more than just a seed, but we inherit a story, and we also inherit a responsibility to make that story more inclusive, and to make it go deeper than just the seed saver, the seed steward who gave that seed to us. In all of these seeds here, there's thousands of years of history. These beans especially, the close cousins cultivated here, grown here for so long in these very mountains before white settlers ever showed up. And that's not a story that you often get just when you're thinking about the people that gave it to you directly. So one of the things that I always try to emphasize, though, is that, like, when we're talking about food, we're talking about people, and oftentimes we're sort of making statements, or we see statements being made about quality of food, and therefore it's like quality of people and quality of cultures. And I always put this in my slides, for the last couple of years, because there was a lot of irony in this. This was a review of Hillbilly Elegy that was calling the film classist and whatnot, but then even in their own sort of description of it, they can't help but sort of making a statement, right, about food, and sort of by doing so making a statement about the kinds of people that might eat that. I love fried bologna, just for the record. That's it's pretty good. But I wanted to talk about just sort of, the idea of like food stories and what some of the stories are and how people, especially people here, have kind of worked with food narrative, and a lot of times it's pushing back on food narrative, and um, thinking more about food stories being stories about people and quality of people. This is just a couple blocks from where I'm standing today in Clarksburg. This is back in the 1930s or so, but there was a business called Sanitary Hot Dog that opened up, and the reason that the business is called Sanitary Hot Dog is because food narratives were at the time, um, the time that this business opened up is sort of when the hot dog joints in Clarksburg were run by minorities. There were Greek and Italian owners. There were a couple black owned hot dog shops, and this is at a time before Greek, Italian, and Spanish immigrants sort of achieved the full privileges of whiteness, if you will. So one of the narratives about hot dogs and the people who ate them, and particularly the people who ran hot dog businesses, was that they were very unsanitary, right? It was this like really racist, classist stereotype of the sort of unsanitary hot dog. So, it was like one of the ways of sort of pushing back against that narrative, that food narrative, was to call it sanitary hot dog. And this is not, of course, I mean, none of the stuff that I'm really talking about here is exclusive to Appalachia. You saw this, I think there was, I want to say San Antonio, there was a tortilla factory called Sanitary Tortilla, and there was actually a lot of some writing done about that, and the same sort of racist stereotypes led to the naming of that. But these kinds of food narratives are all around us, and a lot of the context for what I talk about in terms of Appalachian food narratives have to do with the way that we talk about poverty in America. We sort of create these systems to keep poverty alive and well, to keep people in poverty, and then we create these narratives about what got them there. We never, like, the sort of prevailing narrative is not about the systems. Oftentimes it's like some sort of personal responsibility, or if somebody is poor, it's like their fault, they didn't work hard enough, they were sort of lazy. This is like some kind of like a moral failure almost if you sort of ended up in poverty. If you ended up in poverty, it's not that the system got you there, it's that you did something personally to get there. I mean, that sort of is unfortunately a prevailing narrative in America about poverty, and people really internalize that, especially I think in places, Appalachia sort of was at one point, and it still is in a lot of ways, very synonymous with the idea of poverty. It sort of became like the poster child for American poverty, and in the mid 1900s. But Jello is one thing that people have sort of used to tell a story about how they have escaped that idea of poverty, at least in West Virginia. And I say that because Jello, you need some things to make Jello, and particularly you need refrigeration. And if you're going to have a refrigeration, you need electricity. So the story that Jello was like, for a lot of people, was it sort of became this kind of like empowering piece of food narrative back in, say, like the 1930s, 1940s. And if you actually look at a lot of community cookbooks, you can see when communities got electricity, because that's when the Jello recipes started to come up. But a lot of people really relied on Jello to sort of tell a story. It was like, I'm putting this Jello recipe in this cookbook because if I do so, people will know that I have these resources. I'm able to get electricity. I'm able to have refrigeration. There was sort of a lot of aspirational sort of hopes like tied to that, because of the way, again, that we sort of stigmatize and punish the idea of poverty. And companies like Jello were very, very aggressive on this kind of classist marketing campaign, like particularly in the early 1900s, early to mid 1900s. There were still a lot of communities in West Virginia where people were sort of working together, for instance, to bake bread. I mean, close to Morgantown, there's a community called Scott's Run, and there were these communal ovens that were built. And I want to say there were 17 languages spoke at one time in Scott's Run, maybe even more. But, communities would get together, people from all these different nationalities in this rather diverse coal camp, Scouts Run, and they would bake bread together once or twice a week in these communal ovens. But there was this really aggressive marketing campaign from commercial bread bakeries, about just sort of like almost punishing self-sufficiency by, saying things like, don't get caught with that home baked bread, like make people know that you can afford to go to the store and and buy Wonder Bread or whatever the sort of like commercial version of it was. So people have always sort of been faced with a lot of these food narratives, and and there sometimes it's like it breaks my heart sometimes to see the way that people have stopped interacting with the food that they particularly love because of that internalization of the way that we talk about poverty and the way that we can stigmatize people for being self-sufficient. One of the recipes that I always talk about, this is one that I absolutely love, is vinegar pie. So vinegar pie, the story of vinegar pie is that it's part of a class of desserts that we call desperation pies. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes desperation pies are recipes that are meant to mimic an ingredient that maybe you don't have on hand, that you sort of recreate something that's similar to that based on what you have in the pantry. So vinegar pie, this particular recipe for vinegar pie is a mock lemon pie. And what do you do if you don't have lemons? Maybe we're talking back in the 1930s or so, and lemons in rural West Virginia were prohibitively expensive, oftentimes not even available in the stores. So what do you do if you want to mimic that flavor and you don't have access to it? Well, it turns out you can use apple cider vinegar and nutmeg to achieve a flavor that's like pretty similar. You get the sort of brightness and the acidity from the apple cider vinegar, and then that fragrance that a lemon has. It turns out when you add a little bit of nutmeg to it, it comes pretty darn close. I've had a lot of people that say they thought they were eating a lemon pie because this flavor is so close. And to me, that's just like, it's so inspiring, and it's like having this, magic wand and making something out of, not nothing, but out of very few ingredients. And I think it really speaks to the sort of thrift and innovation of cooks under hard times that inspire me, and I think inspire a lot of these stories. But again, because of the way that we sort of frame poverty in America as being something like a personal failure, that narrative made a lot of people distance themselves from a recipe like vinegar pie, which sort of came to be seen as something that you made not because you wanted to, but because you had to. It was a symbol of hard times and a symbol of necessity. So, our prevailing narrative made people want to escape that. And this is a quote that I found in some of my research about vinegar pie. Is like, clearly this family, this person loved vinegar pie. She wanted her friends to come over and experience it because it was so good. But her mom was concerned, right, that people would think that they were hard up. And like, I think this quote like does a lot to sort of reinforce why we focus on sort of flipping the script, if you will, on some of these foods. Because it's like, what is the problem if we are hard up or if we're poor? That's not, I think, getting back to the idea that these things were sort of created by systems and not by the individuals. I think that part of our goal in storytelling is to sort of destigmatize those conditions, right? And I think that that's sort of where I've seen a lot of interesting things happen is to sort of take something like vinegar pie and to say, like, yes, there is this sort of narrative that's attached to it, but what happens when we think of it differently? What happens when we think of it not as sort of a symbol of shame because we were living in hard times at some point, or our families were living in hard times at some point. But what happens if we sort of take some pride, if you will, in that sort of spirit of inventiveness and innovation that it took to make that vinegar pie with very few resources. There's sort of a lot of people who have come up to us after we serve something like this, and they'll tell us stories of, like, how there was something that I ate when I was growing up and I kind of liked it, but when I was an adult, I decided that I needed to, like, step away from it because I was afraid of what that narrative sort of said about me. But chow chow is another one of those things. So chow chow, some of you may be familiar with it. It's a rather common dish throughout. So there's sort of a version of it throughout the southeastern U.S., and then there's a Pennsylvania Dutch version of it, and there's a couple of other versions here and there. But the version that we make, it's sort of one that was passed down just sort of by making a relish, a pickled or fermented relish out of the garden scraps. So let's say you've got, it's the end of this season, the harvest season, and you're harvesting green tomatoes, and you've already canned a big batch of green tomatoes, but you have a few left and you have a few peppers left. You sort of combine what's left over and you make this relish. And to me, it's just so beautiful and complex and delicious in so many ways. But but again, that's another food where it's like this was sort of associated with hard times and necessity. So even all these decades later, there are these lingering effects. So we want to make the story not about the being a symbol of like these systems that kept people in poverty and this sort of like personal shame associated with it, but about just sort of like being able to make something so beautiful, so complex out of very little. That's something that this in particular, this chow chow, is sort of seemed to, like, seeing people come up to us and say, like, never did I think that I would sort of eat this, like, presented in a way that made me think differently about it and sort of feel good about eating chow chow. That's sort of where you sort of realize the power of that, like, damaging narrative connected to poverty, but also the power of just sort of being able to flip the script a little bit, and this sort of desire to, like, separate ourselves from poverty is sort of driven a lot of, like, tourism marketing in West Virginia, which can be kind of problematic because what it sort of does is it sort of projects this idea of what we think people think we are, based on these really long held stereotypes or these narratives. And I think like one of the things you see is that people sort of latch on to the trend of the Appalachianness, and they use some of the language, but then the imagery is about seafood or some of the things. It's like, yes, come experience the mountain state, but experience the mountain state with the sort of like continental European cuisine or Italian wine or whatever the thing is that just sort of symbolizes wealth and sort of like the opposing version of whatever the image is that people have in mind, or that we think people have in mind. Sometimes it's just that we're sort of projecting what we think other people think of us, and we want to sort of distance it. And that's very, very common, sort of like progressive Appalachian or evolved Appalachian, or like the appetite for Appalachia just sort of like being seafood. It's I think in a lot of ways, I think the intentions are good behind some of these, I think, anyway, but then I think the result sort of ends up being sort of a further stigmatization of what people might see as being food of their families or of their communities. And if they already sort of have an exposure to that narrative of whatever food it is being kind of shameful, then I think sometimes this can sort of further those notions. So, we try to get people to think more about, the stories. Like, what is it that makes them appreciate this food? What is it that makes them keep it going? And that's some of the story that we relay, as chefs. And I'm trying to wrap up here. I know we got kind of a late start, so I want to leave some time for some questions if there are some. But I think one of the powerful things that's happened with me before is when I've worked with some seed keepers or some farmers, and I sort of get the sense that maybe nobody's really asked them about the story behind some of this stuff before. And first their reaction is just sort of like, oh, well, I said, tell me the story behind this, and it's well, it's just beans, right? Or it's just cornbread, or it's just this sausage. We just make it every year. It's not like that special. But then you get them talking a little bit, and it's kind of like opening the floodgates, right? And it's really special to watch that happen, because I've had a farmer before that it was like one of the most sort of powerful moments where he just sort of had this realization. He said, yeah, I've been thinking about this ever since you asked me to tell the story. And this is his great grandmother's heirloom beans that he was keeping and passing on to his daughter and his granddaughter. And he said, yeah, I guess I always knew it. I just didn't really tell myself that the reason I grew this was because of her. It wasn't because of the bean, it was because of her. Right. And I think that's going back to what I was saying earlier, that is sort of something that we share, in common as seed keepers, is we know that the bean is more than just the bean. We know that the corn is more than just corn. And so I'll close with this slide, and just, these are a couple of people that I will talk about this weekend. This is Lou Maiori on the left there. That's his Logan Giant beans that he, gave Amy and I mentioned him briefly earlier. He's 94. He'll be 94 in November, actually. And he's been saving this Logan Giant seed for 70 some years. And the first year that he gave it to Amy and I, he would call us all the time, every week, and say, how's that Logan Giant doing, buddy? And he had the same line in every call, and we're like, that is a good eating bean. And that means so much that he trusted us with that seed. This is Amy's aunt, Ann Odell, on the right, with a few of the seeds that she's kept, and she passed those seeds on to us, and each of those seeds was sort of passed on to us with the story. Ann and her husband ran an appliance business for a long time, and they would make house calls to people in rural West Virginia. And of course, people always want to talk about their gardens and their seeds and their root cellars and all the things that they've canned. So there was a lot of exchanging of canned goods and seeds in particular, and all of the seeds sort of came with the story. And and those stories again make those beans more than just beans, and that's going to be really fun for me this weekend. As I'm prepping for this, I'm thinking ahead to the moment where I serve that plate of green beans, and I see the way that I can see it on people's faces, when the interaction with that food changes based on the story, when they know that this plate of beans that is delicious by itself, it's a delicious plate of beans, right? But when they know about that sort of personal story that came with that bean, and will hopefully continue, when we pass it on to somebody else, then, that plate of beans becomes a lot more, right, than a delicious plate of beans. So I'm going to stop there a little early. Are we still under time there, Chris?
Yeah, we started a bit late, so I think we should definitely give a chance for some questions, and then we'll just do a quick turnaround time for the next presentation, if that's good with everyone. I'm getting some nodding heads. I think we should have done your presentation right before dinner, because I'm hungry. So I got the microphone. I'm gonna see if anyone's got a question, and then we'll go for it.
Okay, hi. Thanks for your presentation. My question is around how these stories come to you, and if you're often working with the stories of like seeds and crops and food, that like, do those come with stories? Or are you ever on the opposite, like kind of the other flip of that being like, are you finding an ingredient or like inspired by something and then have to like track down the story? And if so, like what is that process like? So I'm just curious kind of like your method for like collecting these stories and yeah, how you go about that process. And there's many questions, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the process is very different depending on what it is. I mean, I think with a lot of the seeds that have come to us, we've been very fortunate that some of the seed savers, the seed keepers, are still around and still able to tell us the story, at least that they know about the seed and sort of what it's meant to them and their families. But there are other things like the salt trout, for instance, is something that there aren't people who are around necessarily and making salt trout as much in the late 1800s and early 1900s that can communicate those stories. So that one is something that sort of been a little bit more of a mix of like stories that have been passed down like maybe 2 generations removed and then some historical research. But yeah, I mean, I think the stories that I really hone in on like a personal level are the ones that I am able to get directly from someone. And I think if you look at our garden, it's like, yeah, there's some beans that we just aren't growing this year. I mean, I know that it's like a cherished heirloom bean, but I don't know the story of maybe this one because it came to me from somebody else. So it's just not as significant for me as like Lou's beans or Bernice Morrison's old time lima beans or whatever the one is that we sort of got a story directly from. And I think it's just very different. And sometimes it's like there's something I sort of hear about, and it is just this sort of process of like going and and really like seeking it out, and also sort of seeking out a platform for it. I would say that's the same with food that we prepare and serve to the public, as well as our like documentary work that we've done. Just sort of you'll see it's always a mix of things that we know, things that we don't. But I think that like the important part about it is sort of like being in like constant relation and being in community with people, because I think that the reason that a lot of the seeds have come to us with these intimate stories and these intimate accounts of what they mean to people and their families is because we were able to sort of be in community first and foremost and establish some trust. That's a thing that I have noticed like through my early days of like being in journalism school and trying to tell stories, especially in a place like West Virginia where people sort of feel like their stories and the resources and everything else have been exploited from the outside. There's some hesitation, and rightfully so, and understandably so, about who you share intimate knowledge, seeds, stories with. So I think that's always a really important point to emphasize, particularly where there's a situation where we are making a living either as farmers or as a cooks, or doing something that sort of might attach some kind of sense of a commercial value to whatever we're talking about. That sort of sense of community, that sense of trust is so important before you can really expect anything to just come to you.
Thank you, Mike. We maybe squeeze in one last question if anyone's got one.
Hey, yeah, so I guess I feel like these what you've shared is really inspiring, especially what you just shared as an answer to that last question, like these intimate stories. But I'm curious what you feel the long-term impact on your community. Like, do you see engagement within not just these folks who are already growing things that they're sharing with you, but are there new individuals who are coming to your dinners or participating in projects that you guys work on? Like, I'm curious what you see as an impact?
Yes, I love that you asked that question, because that's sort of one of the things that I could talk about for a very long time. So I'll try to do it more concisely here. But and when I talked earlier about like who the audience is, and that like Amy and I sort of feel a lot more importantly about making the audience for our storytelling work, people from West Virginia, people from Appalachia. I think that a lot of that is because we do have much sort of longer term goals for how stories impact, just mostly like the way that traditions are carried forward or not carried forward. And I think the fact that we've seen so many of these traditions sort of slip away because they've been stripped of the stories have been stripped from the food, it sort of like created a little bit of sense of urgency for us, to see some of the things that we might make, like Amy makes salt rising bread or particular kinds of sausage, and sort of seeing them. I don't mean to say like endangered to sort of sound inflammatory, but there are just not that many people making some of these things, and because in this country, because we have sort of created these narratives around self-sufficiency and poverty, and we've sort of created this sort of like aspirational desire to buy the commercial version of whatever it is, instead of sort of keeping the culturally significant version of whatever it is alive. We absolutely do want to lean heavily on those stories, and for a long-term effect of inspiring more people to take up some of these things, to grow more of these seeds, because I think it's like it's especially eye-opening for people of our generation. So like our grandparents' generation were still doing a lot more of these things, still like doing a lot of these traditions, saving a lot more seed. And then our parents were sort of brought up at this time where it was like the hyper marketing on all the processed commercial versions of everything were sort of like urging those to take the place of whatever the culturally relevant, culturally significant thing was. And there was sort of a lot of loss in that generation, and the sort of acceptance of the sort of like commercial version of whatever it is. So I think that, yeah, I mean, absolutely, like there is a goal of ours to sort of inspire a lot of people to come up and do these things anew, not just to sort of have people keep doing what they're already doing. And I think that works. I mean, maybe I don't really have a good way to sort of gauge how many people, but there are enough people to at least make us feel pretty good, who come. And I was just getting a couple messages earlier today from young chefs and farmers that are in southern West Virginia that we shared some seed with, and they are so excited this week to be seeing like their bloody butcher corn pop up. They've never grown corn before. They have family members who might have grown it, but that's always really special to see, especially young people who are carrying these things on and sort of understanding the responsibility of carrying the story on with it.